Am I making all of this up? A question asked by scapegoats everywhere. Someone recently articulated this question in the private Facebook group that accompanies my online course on recovering from narcissistic abuse. A scapegoat survivor of a narcissistic parent was trying to protect themselves from this parent by maintaining a boundary, and that parent reacted to this person as if they were committing a mortal sin. The narcissistic parent expressed indignation, outrage, and seeming disbelief at this individual. And understandably, the scapegoat survivor felt confused and slightly doubtful of themselves. They found themselves asking questions like, is my parent actually good to me and I somehow fail to see this? Or am I the one being cruel and wrong by thinking of this parent as someone who has hurt me? And can I trust my own perceptions and judgments? Well, in today's video, I want to explain why a narcissistic parent or partner's attempts to invalidate your reality can actually feel so undermining. There are good reasons for this, and understanding them can empower you. Next, I'm going to offer 3 tactics for protecting your ability to believe yourself from a narcissistic abuser's attempts to attack that belief. Well, my name is Jayreid, and I specialize in helping individuals recover from narcissistic abuse in individual therapy and through my online course and accompanying Facebook community. We take a 3-pronged approach to recover. And the first prong involves making sense of what happened so that you know you didn't deserve it. Next is gaining psychological, emotional, and sometimes physical distance from the narcissistic abuser. And third is living in defiance of the narcissistic abuser's rules for living. And if you're interested, I've organized the videos on this channel into 3 playlists that correspond to these 3 prongs. Well, another aspect to define the narcissist's rules for living is taking care of yourself. And that's one of the reasons why I created this free webinar that offers 7 self-care tools to help you in the process of recovering from narcissistic abuse. And you can find the link in the description box below or by clicking here. So why can it be so hard to believe yourself over the narcissistic abuser? Well, if you survived narcissistic abuse, particularly in the role of scapegoat, then you may have had to believe that you were the defective one in order to share a reality with that narcissistic parent or partner. And this can come in the form of, say, the narcissistic abuser expressing bewilderment at your opinions or ideas to convey the message that your judgment or thinking is poor. Later, if you express a feeling, you may be met with recoil or the accusation that you can't control your emotions. The narcissistic abuser may work to influence other family members and friends to react to and think of you similarly, and perhaps much worse. In the end, the scapegoat survivor who's being treated this way often has to assume this pseudo-identity as their own. It's not really a choice, and here's why. When such a systematic effort to invalidate, devalue, and undermine your standing is in place, then protest will only result in exasperation and even despair. Many survivors have come to this harrowing conclusion that there's nothing they can say or do or clear up to convince the narcissistic abuser of their good intentions or good standing. There's a different kind of calculus being used where the survivor has to be found as defective, that nothing else can or will be considered. And again, there's a good reason why this is the case. The narcissistic abuser typically carries their own sense of worthlessness around in the world. But their way of coping with that, and it's a typically unconscious way of coping, is to deny it and relocate those feelings of worthlessness into someone else, often the scapegoated child or partner. Next, that narcissist acts in ways that influence that scapegoat target to adopt these feelings of worthlessness as his or her own. And that's exactly what I'm describing so far in today's videos. The narcissistic parent or partner's efforts to undermine your judgment and perceptions serves the psychological function for the narcissistic abuser of relocating their own sense of worthlessness into you. And that may be one reason why it can feel impossible to clear up their distorted view of you. There's just too much at stake for them. So if you're in a position where the first priority for you is for someone else to be there, and the second priority comes the hope that that person is not only there, but treats you well, then there's really no choice but to comply with the narcissistic abuser's claims that you are indeed defective. And this type of position I'm describing and the necessary priorities quite literally applies to the children of a narcissistic parent. And it can certainly feel this way to a partner of a narcissistic abuser. As the saying goes, our order of preference when it comes to relationships is, first a good relationship. If that's not available, then we'll take a bad relationship. And at all costs, we try to avoid having no relationship. So I really want to emphasize why adopting this view of yourself as having poor judgment or being defective in your judgment is a necessary adaptation when you kind of need to secure the narcissistic abuser's presence in your life. And with that said, the rub in having to comply with the narcissistic abuser's claims of your defectiveness is that these claims are fundamentally not true. So in order to maintain an attachment by sharing a reality with this narcissistic abuser, you must create a sort of false reality within that goes along with the narcissistic abuser's narrative of who you are and who they are. There's a great book about the experience of living in a totalitarian state that you may be familiar with called 1984 by George Orwell. And I remember having to read this in high school and was really blown away by how plainly Orwell described the tricks of mind that had to happen for the followers of a dictator to have loyalty to that dictator. And for our purposes, we might swap out just as easily the term narcissistic abuser for dictator. Well, the main character in this book was a guy named Winston Smith, and he started questioning all the loyalty practices he was being forced to participate in. And one of these practices was what the dictatorship called doublethink. And this is how Winston Smith described it: to forget whatever it was necessary to forget, then to draw it back into memory again at the moment when it was needed, and then promptly to forget it again. And above all, to apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety, consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then, once again, to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you had just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. That's a mouthful, but it gets at the kind of irony that's involved in having to go along with a narcissistic abuser's claim that your judgment is defective. I think doublethink is such a great concept because it captures what it's like to force yourself to believe a lie about yourself, because that lie is so necessary to survive. And I want to emphasize, this lie is not yours or one you've taken delight in believing or even creating, but one that has been imposed upon you by the narcissistically abusive parent or partner. I really think this perfectly describes the process of what the scapegoat has to do to go along with the narcissistic abuser's claims that his or her judgment is defective. So let's say there's a perceptive, kind, generous of spirit child named Shannon. And again, this is an anonymized example culled across personal, professional experience and reading and so forth. But let's say Shannon's natural reactions are to care about the feelings of others and seek connection to them. And let's say in high school, she hears about a project called Habitat for Humanity, where volunteers go to a construction site to help build a house for a family in need of housing. And while there, she starts attending and making friends with some of the other volunteers. Well, unfortunately, Shannon has a narcissistic mother who experiences Shannon's genuine desire to help others and connect to them as a threat to that mother's artificially inflated sense of self-worth. So when Shannon returns home from going to the construction site one Saturday, her mother comes storming into the living room where Shannon's sitting there tired but satisfied with her day's efforts and the camaraderie she got to enjoy with the construction crew. And the mother furiously accuses Shannon of shirking her household chores so she could go off and play do-gooder to others. And next she might tell Shannon that she knows the real Shannon and isn't fooled by what she's trying to play off to others. Now, Shannon in this example has to find a way to believe what her mother is telling her. And I think that process of doublethink is exactly what can happen. Shannon knows at some level that her inclination to help others is genuine. And yet she has to believe the opposite message from her mother, that her desire to help others is disingenuine. So she has to be both aware of her impulses to help others, then quickly change her opinion on what those impulses mean to something in line with her mother's claims. So she might say something to herself like, there I go again, trying to look good to others by helping them, when she notices an impulse to reach out to someone or be kind to them. That in order to stay in some kind of relationship to a narcissistically abusive mother like this, Shannon has to forget that the perception of herself as manipulative or disingenuous started with her mother's tirade against her. And I think that's what Winston Smith means when he says doublethink involves first consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then once again to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you had just performed. In essence, that someone like Shannon has to forget what her mother claimed and work to see it as her own opinion of herself. Well, Shannon and people in her position have to deliberately stop believing themselves in order to believe what's necessary from the narcissistically abusive parent or partner in order to survive. And once it's possible to start to recover from this abuse, I think this is why it can make a survivor wonder, am I making all this up? When your efforts to set boundaries and create needed distance from a narcissistic abuser are met with that incredulousness and attack by that abuser, that sort of how dare you reaction, how it can really get under the survivor's skin in the moment. So what can you do to recover your right to believe your own judgment? Well, if you're working to recover from narcissistic abuse and detoxify yourself from the practice of doublethink, then I think these 3 strategies can be useful. Well, first, it's very important to create and maintain psychological, emotional, and perhaps physical distance from the narcissistic abuser. As I stated earlier, you may have had to engage in this practice of disbelieving yourself in order to share reality with the narcissistic abuser. And as a result, having psychological or emotional closeness with this person can run the risk of having to adopt that same practice in order to be in contact with them. So working to create this kind of distance can really be an important step towards detoxifying from the pressures to engage in doublethink that were experienced in relationship to this narcissistically abusive person. Next, if you find yourself wondering if you're making all of this up, it can be helpful to not engage in an internal debate in order to prove yourself right. Just like in politics, this question kind of frames the debate, where your judgment is already in question from the get-go. Instead, you might try doing something caring towards yourself, like one of the tactics in the webinar I mentioned earlier, or connecting to others who are safe and supportive towards you. And that leads me to the 3rd tactic that can be helpful in restoring your belief and credibility in your own judgment. And that is to gather and connect to people in your life who are curious about you and your perceptions and your judgments, as opposed to seeking to judge whether those perceptions or judgment are right in their eyes, where you get to hold authority over your own perspective rather than grant the other person that authority. And then, lastly, and very importantly, restoring your belief in your own perceptions and judgments and knowing that you've not made any of this up, I really think is a process rather than a single event. I think that when one's psychological and emotional survival depended on suspending belief in your own judgment, then the feeling that something terrible will happen if you reclaim that judgment becomes something that has to diminish over time. I do think, though, in using these 3 steps, it can certainly change in an incremental way, and this process will likely benefit by being compassionate and patient with yourself. And another resource for understanding how and why it was necessary to not believe yourself is Module 2 in my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse. In this video-based part of the course, I cover how the scapegoated child may have had to organize information about themselves and the narcissistic parent in a way that minimizes the parent's wrongdoing towards the child and maximizes the child's own sense of being the bad one in the relationship. Well, thank you for watching today and for your continued engagement with this channel. I'm just very happy and encouraged that you've found some of this content helpful in your own process of recovery. And I look forward to posting again next Sunday. Take care.